At my own wedding reception, my mother-in-law leaned toward a table full of guests and whispered, "She didn't marry my son for love. She married him for money." Someone laughed. Then the family lawyer slowly cleared his throat. "My name is Rebecca Lawson. I am 34 years old. I am a public school art teacher. I chose that path deliberately with full awareness that it would never make me wealthy, because I believed, and still believe, that teaching children to see the world through creativity is work that matters. My classroom smells like acrylic paint and pencil shavings, and I have spent more of my own salary on art supplies than I will ever calculate, and I would not change a single part of that. I grew up in a modest house where the walls were covered in drawings and the bookshelves were full, and money was something we were careful with but never ashamed of not having in abundance. My parents valued effort and curiosity and kindness. Status was not a language we spoke at home. When I met Daniel Hargrove, I thought I had found someone who understood that language or at least respected it. He was warm and genuine when we were alone, and he talked about his family's success with a kind of detachment that made me think he hadn't been entirely shaped by it. I was partially right about that. His parents were a different matter entirely. The Hargroves owned a small chain of hardware stores across 3 towns, and they carried that fact the way some people carry inherited titles, as though it conferred not just financial security, but a superior understanding of how the world worked and who deserved to occupy it. From the first evening I sat at their dinner table, I felt their assessment of me arrive before I had finished introducing myself. His mother, Carol, made small comments, never confrontational, always deniable, remarks about how rewarding it must be to work with children, delivered in a tone that made teaching sound like a hobby someone pursued, while waiting for real life to begin. Observations about the neighborhood I lived in. A single raised eyebrow the first time she saw my car in their driveway. His father, Gerald, operated through silence and implication. He asked Daniel about his work in front of me and then turned the conversation slightly away each time I tried to enter it, with the practiced ease of someone who had long ago decided I was peripheral. I tried. For 2 years of dating and an engagement I tried. I was polite at every gathering. I remembered birthdays. I brought food when invited to dinners and wrote thank you notes the next morning. I tried to demonstrate through consistent and patient effort that I was not what they had decided I was. They were not interested in revising their assessment. But I stayed, because I loved Daniel, and because I believed, perhaps naively, that people could be surprised into better behavior by someone who simply refused to confirm their assumptions. I was not rich. I did not own anything impressive. I drove a sensible car and bought my clothes at the end-of-season sales, and I graded papers on Sunday evenings while other people went out. But I had something Carol and Gerald Hargrove had never once thought to account for. I read everything I signed. If you have ever walked into a room and felt the judgment arrive before the conversation, if you have ever been assessed by what you earn or where you live or what your job title sounds like to people who measure worth in property and income, then you already understand what those 2 years felt like. You know the particular exhaustion of being consistently underestimated by people you are trying to welcome into your life. If that is your experience, this story is yours too. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if this reaches you, click hype before we continue. The wedding reception was held in a large rented hall on the edge of town. String lights, round tables with white linens, a small band that played through dinner, the smell of warm food and flower arrangements, and the particular sweetness of a room full of people who had dressed carefully for the occasion. It was beautiful. I had helped plan every detail of it, and standing inside it that evening, I felt genuinely happy for the first time in weeks. I had been nervous in the lead-up to the wedding. Not about marrying Daniel, about the Hargroves. About what the day would look like with them in the center of it, surrounded by an audience. My concern, as it turned out, was entirely justified. I noticed Carol moving between tables during the first hour of the reception. At first I assumed it was the natural circulation of a mother at her son's wedding, greeting relatives, thanking guests for coming, the ordinary social work of the occasion. I was occupied with my own conversations, my own guests, the small and continuous obligations of being the person everyone wants to speak to on a wedding day. Then I caught a fragment of what she was saying. She was standing 2 tables away, her back partially toward me, speaking to a couple I recognized as longtime family friends. Her voice was not loud, Carol was never loud, but the hall had a particular acoustic quality and the band was between songs. She's a teacher, she said. My son pays for everything. The woman she was speaking to laughed quietly, glanced in my direction. I turned back to the person I had been talking to. My face did not change. I had spent 2 years practicing that skill. The comments kept moving through the room. I could track them by the glances, the way certain guests would look at me and then look away slightly too quickly, with the expression people get when they have just been told something that made them rethink what they were seeing. During the toasts, Gerald stood up and raised his glass to Daniel, who built something real, and to Rebecca, who finally has the comfortable life she deserves. He said it with a warm smile and a slight pause before the word finally, that made the room laugh in that uncertain way people laugh when they're not entirely sure if something was a compliment. I held my glass and smiled. My jaw was tight. Then I heard the sharpest one. A guest at the table directly behind me, responding to something Carol had whispered. Well, let's see how long she sticks around once she's settled in. A small laugh. The clink of glasses. I set my own glass down. Quietly. Carefully. And then from a table near the far wall, a man I recognized as the Hargrove family's longtime attorney slowly pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. The whispers didn't slow down after the toasts. If anything, the first hour of dinner had given them room to spread. I heard the phrase married into money from 2 different directions within 20 minutes. I heard someone at the table nearest the dance floor say, in a low voice that carried farther than intended, I guess she hit the jackpot. A soft laugh followed it. I watched Daniel. He had heard some of it. I could see the discomfort in the set of his shoulders, in the way he kept almost saying something and then redirecting toward his food or his drink or the nearest available conversation. He was not a confrontational person. I had always known that. But watching him choose the path of least resistance while the room quietly constructed a story about his wife was its own particular kind of loneliness. The prenup had been presented 3 weeks before the wedding. Carol had brought it up at a family dinner, framing it as standard practice, the kind of document every family with assets put in place to protect everyone involved. Daniel had come home afterward and sat beside me on the couch and said, with the tone of a man who wanted this conversation to be short, that his parents had asked about it and he thought it made sense to just do it and not make it into something difficult. I had said fine. What I had not said was that I had already begun reading it. The family photos happened between dinner and dessert. I stood where I was positioned, smiled when directed, adjusted when Carol placed a guiding hand on my elbow, and moved me to the left edge of the group formation. I was aware, standing there, that the edges of photographs are where people go when they are considered optional to the central image. Someone near the photographer made the remark about cropping. It was said as a joke, with the light tone of something that didn't require a response. Several people smiled. Daniel shifted beside me. I smiled too, because I was very good at smiling. But something had settled in me by that point. Not anger, something colder and more useful than anger. The Hargroves had been operating for 2 years on the assumption that I was powerless in this situation. That I had come to them without resources, without preparation, without recourse. That my modest income and my art classroom and my sensible car were evidence of a fundamental disadvantage they would always hold over me. They had forgotten one thing. Or rather, they had never known it in the first place. I had been helping people with documents since my mid-20s. It started with a friend who needed help applying for an arts grant and didn't understand the contract language attached to the funding. I sat down with her at my kitchen table and read through it carefully, cross-referencing the clauses against standard grant agreements I found through research, and I helped her identify 2 provisions that would have limited her rights significantly. She got the grant. The provisions were negotiated out before she signed. After that, word spread quietly through my circle. A colleague needed help reviewing a lease agreement. A former student's mother asked about a service contract. I was not a lawyer, I never claimed to be. But I had a methodical mind and a genuine ability to understand language when I worked through it slowly, and people trusted me with their documents. When the prenup arrived, I treated it the same way. I read it over 3 evenings, paragraph by paragraph, clause by clause, with a legal glossary open in another browser tab and a notebook beside me for questions. Daniel thought I was doing lesson planning. I let him think that. By the 3rd evening I had found it. Buried in the latter portion of the agreement, in the section dealing with reputational conduct during the marriage, was a defamation protection clause. It was written in dense language, the kind of language that most people skim past because it reads like boilerplate. But what it said, in plain terms, was that either party to the agreement was protected from public statements made by members of the opposing family that could be reasonably interpreted as damaging to their professional or social reputation. If such statements were made, witnessed, and documented, the clause allowed for significant financial penalties to be pursued against the party whose family member made the statements. I read it 4 times. Then I called Daniel's cousin Thomas, who had warned me 6 months earlier that the Hargroves had a habit of using legal documents as control mechanisms within the family. Thomas read the clause over the phone while I read it to him. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "do you understand what that means if they say something publicly at the wedding?" I told him I understood exactly what it meant. I contacted a lawyer the following day. Not the Hargrove family lawyer, my own. A woman named Sandra Price who worked out of a small office downtown and who, after reading the prenup in full, confirmed my analysis and told me the clause was unusually strong and that Carol and Gerald had almost certainly never read their own document carefully enough to remember it was there. She also told me to document everything. And then she told me to wait. Thomas had always existed at the edges of the Hargrove family, the way I had been positioned at the edges of their photographs. He was Daniel's cousin on his father's side, the son of a sibling who had chosen a different kind of life and never quite recovered from the family's disapproval of that choice. He was thoughtful and observant, and he had been watching the Hargroves operate for 30 years. He had reached out to me privately 6 months before the wedding with a directness I appreciated. "They are going to try to make you feel small. Read whatever they put in front of you before you sign it." That warning had changed everything. At the reception, I saw Thomas near the edge of the room watching. When the comments started spreading and I caught his eye from across the hall, he gave me a single small nod. The kind that said, "I see it. I'm here. You know what to do."
Carol was growing more comfortable as the evening progressed. Confidence does that; it expands into whatever space it's given. She had started the evening with quiet whispers, and by the time dinner was half finished, she was leaning into the next table over with barely concealed amusement, telling someone she hoped the marriage lasted at least a few years. Gerald laughed at something a relative said, raised his glass again. The lawyer, a man named Arthur Weil, who had handled the Hargrove family's legal affairs for nearly 20 years, had been sitting at a corner table for most of the evening. He was older, deliberate in his movements, and he had the expression of a man who had watched a significant amount of human behavior across a long career and had developed clear opinions about most of it. He had been listening. And then, when Daniel's mother leaned toward the next table and said clearly enough for the surrounding guests to hear that Rebecca had only stayed with Daniel because of what the family was worth, Arthur, while set down his glass, pressed his palms to the table and stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He asked, politely, for the room's attention. The band had paused between songs. The timing was, from where I was sitting, almost precise enough to seem arranged, which it was not, but which I did not mind. Arthur looked across the room toward Carol and Gerald with the expression of a professional who is performing an uncomfortable but necessary function. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. "But I've been sitting here this evening, and I've heard something repeated several times that I want to address directly." The room was quiet now. Fully quiet. The kind of quiet that happens in a large space when everyone understands simultaneously that something real is occurring. He looked at Carol. "Are you certain," he said calmly, "that these are the claims you want repeated publicly this evening?" Carol blinked. The confidence shifted slightly in her face. Not gone, but uncertain for the first time all night. "It was only conversation," Gerald said. "Just family talk." Arthur opened the slim folder he had carried to the table from his seat. He explained to the room that the prenuptial agreement the Hargrove family had drafted and presented to Rebecca contained a defamation protection clause. He explained, without embellishment, what the clause said and what it meant. He explained that statements damaging to Rebecca's professional and social reputation, made publicly by members of the Hargrove family and witnessed by multiple guests, fell directly within the clause's scope. He then noted that he had personally drafted that agreement and that he was standing up because he had now heard the relevant statements made, in this room, on at least 4 separate occasions. The room was completely still. Carol's expression moved through several things quickly. Confusion first, then the beginning of a response, then something that looked very much like the realization that she had not read the document she had insisted Rebecca sign. "It was a joke," she said. "Everyone here knows it was a joke." I set my champagne glass down and spoke for the first time since Arthur had stood up. "You've been telling people I married your son for money since before we were engaged," I said. "Tonight you said it in front of everyone. The only thing that changed tonight is that everyone could hear you." Daniel turned to his parents. "Why would you say that about her?" he said. Quietly, but clearly enough. Gerald started to speak. Carol started to speak. Arthur calmly indicated the folder and reminded them, in the measured tone of a man who had no personal investment in the outcome beyond the correct application of a legal document, that the witnesses in the room constituted a documented public occasion. The guests nearest to us were very still. No one was looking away. Carol reached for her water glass. Her hand was not entirely steady. The reception continued. The band played again. Dessert was served. People moved between tables and refilled their glasses and made conversation in the way that people make conversation when a room has shifted and everyone is quietly recalibrating. Carol and Gerald did not circulate after that. They sat at their table and responded to direct questions and did not lean toward neighboring guests with lowered voices. The body language of two people who had understood, in public, that they had made a miscalculation. Several guests came to find me before the evening ended. Not everyone, but enough. They apologized for laughing at the toast. A woman I had only met that evening told me quietly that she had thought something seemed wrong when she heard the whispers. An older relative of Daniel's pressed my hand and said she was sorry it had happened this way. I thanked each of them. Daniel found me near the end of the night. He said he was sorry he hadn't spoken sooner. I told him the truth, that I needed him to understand the difference between discomfort and silence, and that going forward, I needed him to choose differently. He listened. He didn't argue. In the weeks after the wedding, Daniel had several direct conversations with his parents about their behavior, conversations he had avoided for years and which, I suspect, only became possible because the public nature of what had happened removed the option of pretending it hadn't. Carol and Gerald never apologized directly. I had not expected them to. But the comments stopped. The whispers, the small judgments offered in the presence of other people, those stopped. Whether from genuine reflection or simply the awareness that I was no longer someone they could afford to dismiss, I did not spend much energy trying to determine. The outcome was the same. I thought about what I had wanted from that family. Not their approval, I had released that expectation early. What I had wanted, and what I had spent 2 years quietly trying to earn, was simple recognition. The basic acknowledgement that I was a person of value who had chosen their son because I loved him. Respect was never something the Hargroves planned to offer me. But the truth had a way of making itself present anyway. And the room full of witnesses that evening had heard what Carol actually thought of me, and then they had heard what happened when that belief met something she had never bothered to read. They had spent 2 years convinced that they understood my motives. The one thing I had ever wanted from them was the one thing money could not be used to withhold forever. If you have ever been judged by people who decided they knew your motives before they knew anything real about you, if you have been labeled and whispered about and positioned at the edges of photographs by people who treated your presence as temporary, then you understand the particular weight of that experience. It is not the loudest kind of cruelty, it does not announce itself. It arrives in small, deniable increments, and it is designed to make you question whether you are perceiving it correctly, whether you are being too sensitive, whether the right response is simply to smile and absorb it and wait for them to eventually change. They don't always change. But the truth has a way of surfacing when the conditions are right. And patience, real, prepared, documented patience, is its own kind of power. If you've been in that room, leave your story in the comments. Other people need to read it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Click hype to help this reach someone who needs to hear it.